is Izzy from Minerva. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at how to create an inverted pleat skirt. We're going to have 2 pleats at the front and 1 at the back. Once I've shown you how to do that, you can obviously adapt that in whatever way that you want, adding more pleats or less, whatever you want to do. You can raise the height of the pleat or drop it down, and that will have a massive effect on how the skirt looks and sits on your body. This is a really nice detail to be doing, and it's very common as well, so I think it's going to be really useful for you today. As ever for these videos, you're going to need the standard tools of your own body block, some tracing paper to be tracing over that. You'll also need your pattern ruler and a pencil, maybe a few different colours of pencils as well, so that you can make sure that you're annotating the right bits. And yeah, just the sense of adventure to come and join me today. So let's get started. To start off with, please just trace over your skirt block so that you've got an exact replica of that on some tracing paper, which we can then cut and adapt and add bits onto. So for the purpose of this video, I've effectively printed out my skirt block because I've got that drawn up on the computer. If you are able to use Illustrator or any CAD software like Revit, ArchiCAD, AutoCAD, I'd really recommend drawing up your body block accurately using that software, because then you can just print off as many copies of your block as you want to and just adapt it really quickly, which is, you know, what I've done here. So you've traced out your skirt block, and we're going to start looking at our skirt back. On our skirt back piece, we actually want to add volume into the back so that we're creating the pleat in the skirt, and going to be folded back on itself. So we're going to add a volume on. So grab your tracing paper and that you've got your body block on, which is this, and put another piece of paper behind it, similar to how I've done here. And the first thing that we're going to do is to start to draw on this paper using our pattern ruler. Start off by drawing one long line, which is the same length as your skirt piece. I then want you to draw another line which is parallel to this line, 10 centimetres offset. Now, depending on the volume that you want for your pleat to have, you may want to play around with adjusting this measurement. So you may want to do 10, you may want to do 8, you may want to do a 6. It just really depends on the aesthetics of what you're trying to create. But for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to use 10. And then create a third line at 10 centimetres again. So now we've got 2 additional panels, 2 chunks that we're going to add into our skirt, which are 10 centimetres wide each. This line down here is now going to become our centre back. And we are simply going to attach our skirt piece onto that. Now I'm just going to use some masking tape just to hold this in place while I trace around it in a minute using tracing paper. I would recommend that you do the same so that you don't end up with any bits of paper all kind of shifted around and inaccuracies in your final pattern piece. So now I just want you to join a line to continue this hem line along your knee right to the end of here, and that should be parallel. You should have a nice right angle at that point. And the same scenario over here as well. So nice parallel line lining up the waist centre back point with your new centre back point for your skirt. At this point, we're just going to add our tracing paper and pop it on top of our new drafted block so we can add our seam allowances and make our pattern piece. Now for this particular skirt, I'm just going to assume that the hemline of the skirt stays at where the knee is. That's where I want it. So my first thing I'm going to do is add a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the bottom of the skirt down here to allow for my hem, and extend it all the way up to that line. At our side seam, again, we're going to want a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, and that is a nice straight line all the way up to the hip. At which point we just need to mark off the 1.5 at regular intervals to accommodate that nice curve along the side seam. Use your pattern ruler to accommodate that curve and to sketch that in again, extending up past the waistline. And the waist also then needs a seam allowance of 1.5. Again, this is curved, so make sure you're just marking it off at regular intervals, 1.5 all the way along. And don't forget to add in your darts, extending the line all the way up to the waistband. Now then, we've drawn round the skirt back piece, which is great. Our centre back line was here, however, the centre back line is now over here because we've added this volume in. This is going to be concertinaed and folded back on itself, so this still effectively will be our centre back line, and this volume will be incorporated underneath and sort of sitting here, 10 centimetres there, folded back on itself. So we are assuming that this skirt is going to be cut on the fold. So I'm not going to allow a seam allowance at the centre back because the skirt will be cut on the fold. Consequently, just draw a line all the way down your newly drafted centre back line. And then at the top of that pleat that you've just added in, allow a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So we've drawn around the skirt now. We're now going to add in our key bits of annotation so that when we cut it out, we know exactly what we're doing. So let's go for it now. The first thing we're going to add in is our hip line. I'm then going to add the grain line in, which is going to run parallel with the centre back. And down along our new centre back line, I'm going to write an annotation that just reminds us to cut this on the fold. Right, so we need to give this pattern piece a name now. This is our inverted pleat skirt, but I'm just going to call it a pleat skirt. And this is our skirt back. And we're going to cut 1 on the fold. Further annotations are going to be to denote that this is the side seam. And up here is our waist. We've got this pleat feature which we need to annotate on our pattern piece so that when we actually come around to cutting it out, we know exactly what we need to do and where we need to fold it. So I'm going to add a little line of dots around our original centre back so that when I come to sew this, I'm going to know to align this line with the corresponding other half and sew that together. And then I also want to know when I'm creating this pleat where I'm going to be folding it. So the other thing I'm going to do is add a little notch down there and another one up here. So we've got one down there, one up here. This is going to be our stitch line. So you might want to annotate that so that you know when you come back to the pattern piece that that is your stitch line for your centre back. And then the other thing on the skirt is we're going to want to know where we want our split of our pleat to start. So that needs to be consistent across the front and the back. So I'm going to measure off from the hips and say that I want the pleats to start 10 centimetres from the hip line. So that line then becomes my pleat stitch line. Perfect. So now that we've added our seam allowance and we've annotated our skirt back, we're going to cut that out and then start on our skirt front. For our skirt front piece, we're wanting to create 3 panels for the skirt front. So we're going to do that first, and then we want to add the pleats into the 2 panels that are going to be running parallel down the side of the skirt. So first of all, get your skirt front piece, measure the distance across the widest part of your skirt, which is most likely to be your hips, but might be a bit lower down, and divide that by 3. For me, that's 25.4 divided by 3, 8.4. I then want you to measure off that dimension, 1/3 of the entire distance from across the hip or the widest point of your skirt, and just mark it on the pattern piece. For me, that's 8.4. At this point, we're just going to square it down to the knee and up to the waist. Now we want to move this dart so that it is incorporated into this new side seam. So to start off with, take the measurement from the waist down to the bottom of the dart and make a note of that on your new line. For me, that was 17. And then measure the distance across the front of the dart. For me, that's 2.5. And we want to transfer that distance over to here. So if it's 2.5 overall width, divide the width by 2 and offset it from this new line by half the overall distance. So for me, my overall was 2.5, so I'm reducing it down to 1.25 on either side of that centre dart. And then draw in your new dart line from the waist down to the point of the dart. At this point, we're just going to cut that line straight up. We now want to add the volume of the pleat into the front skirt, which is here. The volume of the pleat should be the same amount as what we did for the back skirt. So for me, that was 10 centimetres. For you, you do whatever you should be doing for that. And I want you to measure off 4 lines at that distance. So at this point, you can then just draw those lines, join them all up together, and these will be your new pleat lines. The next thing to do is to extend our hemline all the way across these new pleats. And the same with the waist up at the top. Grab some masking tape, pop it on the back of your panel where your centre front is, and then pop that on a piece of paper so that it's aligning with the dots and the marker that you did here. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 panels, and you've got another one down here. Align that really nice and neatly up there. So this was 10 centimetres. Great. So we've done that. We've got our basic block now for our inverted pleat. We've got all the volume added into here that we're going to need for our front. This line, so this skirt front is then going to fold up and sort of match up with this, and that also will match up with this. And we're still going to need to sew in our dart as well, which is still here. So that's great that we've got those lines there. We're now going to grab some tracing paper and trace over and add our seam allowance. Great, we're going to start by adding our 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to our hem, which has got huge now, hasn't it? We're going to need to add our seam allowance of 1.5 to our side seam, which is here, and 1.5 along the curve of the hip line at side seam 2. So just mark that on with a couple of regular dots at regular intervals, 1.5. Join it up with a nice curve. Add your 1.5 seam allowance at the top. Now our centre front is going to be cut on the fold, so all we need to do is just follow our original block line at this point. We're not adding a seam allowance in here. I'm going to add in the hip line next, so you can see the hip line here and here. So we're just going to join that up nicely and make sure we've got that all annotated beautifully. And then we also need to draw in this dart here and this line. This will be our stitch line when we're tying the skirt together and sewing it together. And follow the dart line across here up to the waist, because we still need to take that volume out of the waist, because we moved this dart across, didn't we? Add an annotation here just to stay stitch line. And we're going to do the same over here, following the curve and the line of the dart at this point here. I'm just going to bring the back of my skirt piece onto our front and just double check what the distance was for my pleat line here. Right, so mine was 10 centimetres. So we're going to add that pleat line onto here. That's going to be 10 centimetres offset from the hip line. So just mark that on a few places. And then just draw in another little dashed line here. At this point, we're just going to add some little notches to where the top of our pleats are. We're then going to add our grain line and then add in the annotation up here for this to be placed on the fold. So this is our pleat skirt. We're going to name this pattern piece now. Once you've added your seam allowances and all your annotation to your new pattern piece, you can cut that out. Okay, so we've now drafted our skirt front and our skirt back. And the only thing that we need to make a note of now is because it's going to be opened up along the side, that's where our opening is going to be. We obviously have to get into the skirt once we've cut it out and sewn it up together. So for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to assume you're going to do an invisible zip up the side seam. So on both of your pattern pieces, you're going to want to mark that on your pattern pieces so that you don't forget to only, on one side, only to sew up to the zip line. So if you get your two pattern pieces, this is the back, this is the front, and just join up where those two side seams are. That's where they're going to be meeting effectively, isn't it? We want our zip to extend from the waist to below the hip line, simply because the hip is our widest part. So if we want to get the garment up and over our hip, we really want the skirt to be able to open up at that point to allow us to get in nice and easily. So grab your ruler and just mark off a point 5 centimeters below your hip line and just annotate it to say zip. Now the zip is always going to go on the left side of your body as you wear it, so that's important to make a note of as well. Obviously the annotation will be on both side seams, but when we're sewing it together, we're just going to remember which side the zip is going to be cut on. Great, okay, so now you've got both of your pattern pieces, your skirt back and your skirt front. We've added in the volume for the pleats and we're going to go cut that out in calico now, so off you go. Okay, so we've now cut out our skirt using calico fabric. That's what I'm using. You may well be using some really beautiful fabric for your skirt, but what we need to do now is to transfer our critical line markings and notches from our pattern pieces onto the fabric. So let's do that together now. We're going to start by looking at what we need to do for our skirt back piece. To start off with, we're just going to add in our notches. I'm now going to use my dressmaker's carbon paper and my pattern trace wheel to transfer the two dart lines onto the fabric. The other thing that I want to also trace along is this stitch line here where I've put stitch line for centre back. I'm also going to draw along here where it says the pleat line. We also want to transfer those line markings to the other piece on the other side. So pop your piece of carbon paper underneath facing up and trace over those again, pressing down nice and hard, and that should be coming through beautifully. So at this point you can see that we've transferred our line markings onto our skirt piece. We've got some lovely little darts at the top up here, we've got two of those here, and then we've got our stitch line. So that is on both sides of the fabric. Next, repeat the process of adding your notches and transferring your line markings onto the skirt front. Great, so we've cut out our pattern pieces and now we're going to start by constructing the pleats first of all. So let's do that on the back piece first. So the very first thing we're going to do is just to sew these two darts here and here. So we're going to grab our pins and pinch that fabric together. So go ahead and pin all of those darts together at the same time. For the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to be using some blue thread so you can really clearly see where my thread lines are. But obviously if you're doing your final finished garment, you're going to want to choose a matching thread. Sew those 4 darts from the waist down to the end of the dart, and then press those darts out towards the relevant side seam. Okay, great. So here comes the fun part to do with the box pleat. So we've done our darts, we're going to do our box pleat now. Now we've marked on here 3 lines that intersect. So 2 going straight down, and that was our stitch line, and then this one going across here, which was our pleat line. Now what we want to do is to fold this whole piece with right sides together. So the right side is now facing up, and we're going to fold it over so the right sides are together. Making sure that that is nice and neat, that's perfectly accurate. And that it's aligning all the way down. Now what I want to do at this point is sew it together from the top of the waistband where our stitch line marking was all the way down to the pleat line. At this point when I get here I'm just going to reinforce the stitches because that is where the pleat opening, the top of the V, is going to be at this point here. So we've got our really helpful line markings here, and we've got our notch at the top here, so we know that's where we want to start aligning our fabric. So pop your pins in exactly the same method as you did for your dart. Keep checking and turning the fabric over to check that the pin is going through both of those lines. Okay, so we've pinned from the waist down to this point here, and then I just want you to sew it all the way down, reinforcing at the top and the bottom. Okay, so now if we open it up like this, you can see we've got the top of our skirt here. It's all attached down the centre back seam, so it looks like you've got a seam there, but we've got a bit of an opening here. However, all of our fabric is currently pushed towards that side, and we want it to be evenly distributed down at the bottom down here. So what we're going to do is just flip that open. And then up at the top up here, we've got a number of different notches, yeah? So we've got these two notches here, which denoted the fold lines. So I want you just to evenly distribute those so that you've got a fold where the notches are, and just align them up here with the waistband. At this point, I'd recommend just basting that in place. What we need to do now is just iron this so that the pleats, so that these lines are correctly aligned, so that they are sitting really nicely. Again, we've got our notches that we did down at the bottom of the skirt, so you can just pop a pin just through the 2 layers of fabric for the pleat. You can pop a pin in there and one in at the bottom down here, and we're just going to iron straight down from the front all the way down, so we've got a nice good solid crease there for the centre back of the skirt. And then we're also going to iron the pleat on this side at the back, so that we've got a nice straight line from there all the way down to there. What you can do at this point, if you've got really big pleats like I have here, just to stabilise the fabric and to help it stay in place, you can just sew along here as far as you can up to that point, up to the crease, and then just sew through the pleat on this side as well, just so that it's holding its sort of weight at that point. So as you can see, by just reinforcing this pleat at this point along here, all we've done is just make sure that it's going to hang really nicely when we roll it over to the front. And we can just see that that's going to open up really nicely, and it's going to hang. This bit won't drag or kind of fall out of place because we've reinforced it at this point here. Repeat the process of sewing those pleats on the skirt front, but this time you're creating 2 pleats, one on either side of the centre of the front of the skirt. So now we're going to sew the front to the back. We're going to sew the right side seam all the way from the waist down to the hips, but the left side seam is where our zip opening or button opening, or however you want to open and close your skirt, where that's going to be on the left hand side of the skirt. So just pin and sew those side seams down in place, making sure to leave that gap at the top for the opening. Brilliant. So the only thing left to do now on this skirt is your hem and your waistband. As we said in previous videos, we're just doing a very basic hem here, just for the purpose of showing you the construction of the skirt. If you're doing this for real, you might want to change your hemming technique. You might want to overlock the edge and then stitch it nicely. You might want to fold it under twice so that you finish off the hem really beautifully. You might have drawn and drafted, you know, a 2 centimetre hem, so that gives you much more space to have a deeper hemline. And likewise with the waistband up at the top as well. We've not drafted a waistband on this pattern because all we're showing you on this particular video is how to change and add volume to your skirt piece. We'll do a separate series all about waistbands and facings and all of that to cover that later on. So for the purpose of this video, we're just going to roll the hem up 1.5 centimetres and roll the waistband down 1.5 centimetres, so that when we put the garment on and pin it into place on our body, we can see that it's sitting exactly where we drafted it to sit. Okay, cool. So here we go. This is our pleated skirt. This is the toile in calico that I've got on in front of you right now. We've got one central panel, 2 sides, and it opens out into 2 lovely little kicks of volume down at the bottom down there. So as you walk, they're just nicely opening up, which is really cool. Side seam and back, and then obviously we've got our center centre panel down the back, and it opens up into the box pleat at the back as well. So a really beautiful skirt design, full of lots of different variations that you could do. You could imagine if the box pleats were much higher up, you'd suddenly have a lot more volume to your skirt, it'd be less fitted around the hips. If it was much more fitted all the way down over the hips to the knees, and then the box pleat kicked out at the knees, and you had a maxi skirt. Oh, that would look lush as well. So loads of different alternative options that you can try with this particular style. I hope you've really enjoyed that process and you had lots of fun with it. As ever, do put your comments below in the video, and we always love to hear from you here at Minerva, and please do post pictures of your makes on our Minerva community page. We absolutely love that. We love to hear from you, so do let us know your comments, and I can't wait to see your versions. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.